All right, let's continue with biomechanical principles and the principle of stability. So, a few things that are important for stability: the height of your center of gravity, and that's typically if you're on something high and you're feeling unstable, what do? But you kneel down, crouch down, lie down. Also important for the stability is the mass of a person. That's why we'll see front linemen being rather large, relatively speaking, because a larger mass is harder to make unstable. Another thing is your base of support and where your center of mass is relative to that base of support. So we have different options here. So what are you going to choose if you're on BART? You have bags in your hand and no place to sit. Right? Typically you're going to choose, let me see if I can get my pointer to work. Typically you're going to choose this one, right? So you're stable in the anterior posterior direction. So if there's when you start the train, you'll lean backwards or lean forward so you don't go backwards, and vice versa when you stop. Something like this is reasonably stable in the medial lateral plane, not so much in the anterior. This is very unstable, right? You don't have a lot of AP room or medial lateral room for your base of support to roam around in, if you will. Here's a stance D of linemen. And so this is interesting. They want their base of support, or their center of mass within this base of support, but they also want to be very close to the edge of this base of support so they can move forward very quickly. And this would be an image of somebody maybe on a starting block. And again, you'd want your base of support to be right on the edge so you're stable until you want to be quote unquote unstable to take off very quickly. All right, summation of segment velocities. So this gets into summing and coordination some more. And so if you look at somebody throwing a ball, usually starts with your base of support, and then you have hip rotation, internal, external, depending on which way you're moving. You have glenohumeral rotation, elbow extension, wrist flexion, and then you have the release of the ball. And so they looked at the velocity, meters per second. It was in the beginning of the motion, it was high at the glenohumeral joint, then it transferred to the elbow joint, who had the max speed or velocity, to the knuckle. I don't know what the knuckle is, but here you see the wrist is higher than the elbow, and then eventually all that linear velocity is transferred to the ball. So we kind of go from this proximal to distal, increasing the velocity overall as we go up the chain, right? Shoulder was here, went higher, higher, and then higher up when the ball was released. Some of that is what we learned before. The relationship between linear and angular velocity is based on the radius, right? So your radius starts to increase, whoops, as you release the ball. That's one reason for it. Another reason is we'll talk about in the next slide is the moment of inertia, right? So here we have the increase in radius increases the velocity. This is just a different look at it. It has the velocity of your pelvis right here, your trunk or your thorax, your arms, and then the club. So this is obviously golf. And again, it's sequenced, right? Kind of like there's a timed release. Sorry for my poor drawing. And the club swings quote unquote last and has the highest rotational speed. It'll have the greatest radius, and then so the ball will have the greatest linear velocity. So there's a sequencing or a coordination to many of these racket tasks. All right, another way to look at this is that you have your angular momentum, which is your mass times velocity. Your angular momentum is your mass, times your moment of inertia, which is your angular velocity times its radius. So we see the angular speed increase, and we also have an increase in the R, but a decrease in the mass as you rotate up the chain. right? Because when you rotate from your hips, you're rotating your entire trunk. When you rotate at the glenohumeral joint, you're only moving the upper limb. When you rotate at the elbow, you're only rotating your forearm, etc., etc. So the mass decreases while this radius increases, so you get a higher angular velocity. All right, and so we can see the increase in angular velocity. You have about 600 degrees per second of rotation of the hips. Glenohumeral is higher, and then distal segments are even higher. Now, this sequential kinetic link, or increasing the speed as you go from proximal to distal, is the sequential kinetic link. You have the simultaneous kinetic link when you want to just maximize the impulse on the ground. And the closest thing to a simultaneous kinetic link would be trying to apply a huge ground reaction force to the ground so you jump as high as possible. All right, and again, back to this transfer of momentum from larger to smaller body segments. If the mass decreases, the velocity will increase. If you have a decrease in mass, your velocity will increase, as does your radius. So you're kind of getting an increase in velocity from two different concepts in biomechanics as you do this sequential motion, which results in this transfer of momentum from larger segments to smaller segments. All right, production of angular impulse. To have angular momentum, to do all kinds of fun things with snowboarding, ice skating, diving, any sort of spinning, you have to produce an angular impulse. And so to do that, you apply a force at a moment arm to rotate your body. So say divers, they're not completely over the diving board. Where they apply their ground reaction force is a bit of a distance from their center of mass to create this angular impulse, which then results in the conservation of angular momentum during the dive. And then they can change their moment of inertia to spin faster or slower and do all the kinds of tricks that we see. Another use of this angular impulse is, say, during hockey, right? Most people do not hit right through the center of mass, because you would just kind of linearly push that person, but you want to check somebody a distance away from that center of mass to create an angular impulse or an angular rotation, which is a little bit more destructive, I guess, to your opponent. And then finally, which kind of goes up to proximal stiffness for distal mobility, you want to eliminate energy leaks or any unwanted motion, right? So to be as efficient as possible, and you've probably experienced this as you've increased your skill level in certain activities, you eliminate co-contraction, you're just more fluid, right? So when we watch, as always, I go back to basketball, as we watch some of these pros, they are a little bit more fluid in their shooting sometimes than, say, 8-year-old boys or girls trying to learn to shoot for the first time. All right, conservation of momentum, just a different graphic or a graphical view. Your moment of inertia and your angular velocity, and they are inversely related. So as your moment of inertia goes down, your angular velocity goes up, say during the tuck of a dive. And so you have this high velocity, twirl, 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 and then you want to untuck. So you're untucking here, increasing your moment of inertia, so your velocity goes down and you can enter the water. And that's it.